and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care. Part 2, what's the latest on UPICs? Highlights from recent audit activity. Brian, thanks for joining me for this very important part 2. We can't leave people hanging. It's like a cliffhanger, like what's going to happen next? What's the exciting stuff? Which that's come out with the bang. We're going to be talking about patient interviews because this gets everyone just talk about like hair on fire when you start hearing that some government investigator is talking to your patients. People are really beside themselves. And this is not a new tactic, but one that just came up late last week again. And I expect, maybe on the resurgence, but people might say like, do they have a right to talk to my patients? And the answer is, yes, they do. They're the federal government, right? So
yeah, and there's a couple levels of layers of concern here. One is, you have these vulnerable dying patients who they get a knock on the door from the government. How does that affect their well-being? And that's really what our clients are coming to us and are alarmed about is that, these vulnerable patients can be jostled in that way, or their family members in these unannounced visits. And then secondly, what does that say about what the government is doing with regard to the hospice? Is there an audit afoot, or what's being investigated and why, and trying to figure out what's at the bottom of that?
Well, and Brian, to the patient perspective, I think there's so many scammers out there. So part of it might be, are these people really legitimate? Because unannounced people with showing you some business cards is scary. And I think this is a very common occurrence, is people think their Medicare benefit is in jeopardy. Like they're not going to get their healthcare services paid for, which is, if someone is going to try to, say, I don't have health insurance anymore, like I would, be very distraught. And so I think because their business card will typically have, Medicare on there, CMS, whatever it says. And in terms of who uses this tactic, it's UPICs, and also the OIG can use them. But that's the other concern, is people think their actual health coverage is in jeopardy. And I don't know that the people doing these interviews are always the best at like explaining that or putting that at ease.
Perhaps not a bedside manner from these investigators whose cards say they're a fraud investigator. And so, a lot of reasons that this can be alarming to patients, to families, to hospices, but it happens. And so, the best thing to do is be prepared and stay on top of it to learn as much as you can about them.
Yeah. So I think that oftentimes with patient interviews, 9 times out of 10, you have not gotten a record request yet from the government. This is the first clue you have that you likely will. Now, depending on if it's a UPIC or the OIG, what kind of record request that might be. Is it just a UPIC record request, or is it something different? I think it is actually really good information if you find out that someone's talking to your patients, like they called you or they mentioned it to the nurse on a visit, because the more you can understand what's going on, you can try to, you're still behind the 8 ball, so you're not 10 steps ahead, but at least you're not like, hey, I didn't know anyone was talking to my patients. But so it's legal for them to do that. Now, there are patients who have refused to talk to these people, and obviously they don't force their way into your home or whatever. But right. So some people decline that visit and other people have the visit. And oftentimes these visitors, they're not clinicians themselves. Sometimes they do and have brought nurses, but oftentimes they're asking, and maybe share, Brian, some of the kinds of questions that are oftentimes asked.
Yeah, and it's changed over the years. I think what we're seeing more recently is they're kind of checking up on it seems like, is the hospice really doing what its medical records might suggest that it's doing? How frequent are you being visited? Do you know who the hospice folks are? Are you canceling visits, or is the hospice canceling visits? What's the quality of the care you're providing? Kind of an open-ended general question. Meg, as you said, sometimes they get into questions or I guess they're investigating into what's the patient's overall condition. We know this because through Freedom of Information Act requests, which can be a real good friend of ours, we've been able to obtain some redacted memos of some of these visits and interviews where the investigators are making, they might not be asking questions explicitly about condition, but they're certainly making observations about patient bedbound, patient's appearance, and so on. So they could be doing that kind of evaluation as well. So it's all geared toward, developing their record for an audit. And so by the time they're doing investigations, it is probably the case that they've already identified some patients through whatever means, a complaint or data analytics, and then they go out and interview them. And then typically soon after that, you'll get a record request from the auditors that list those patients. And Meg, as you said, thankfully, I think it's a tribute to the kind of trust that patients have in hospices that hospices are often receiving information from the patients themselves, where they're going to their case manager or nurse and saying, "Hey, I got visited. Is this right? Is this okay?" And once we get that information, it really is helpful because it allows the hospice to try to take measure of itself and try to figure out what's going on. And there's ways you can kind of appropriately try to expand or do your own investigation to prepare for the audit that seems to be inevitably coming your way.
Yeah, because I think the more you can find out, sort of the better. I think there's PR, I have that in air quotes, because I think if, let's say they go to visit one of your facility patients, right, that can make your facility partner a bit uneasy, like, oh, I don't want to be involved with this, hospice, they're getting investigated or something. And so I think in terms of managing these issues, which we're going to talk about some different techniques. I mean, one of these things is, how do you explain to, other folks about what this is and what it isn't? With that said, I would say if you're in healthcare, most people know that just because you're getting audited doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. So I think most of the time, a facility isn't going to be ringing alarm bells, but something I think you need to be aware of is people probably don't know the level at which auditing happens. Routine audits, even UPICs, are almost routine at this point for hospices, including very good hospices, and sort of how much do you want to message that, right? You don't want to over respond to things and then because it makes you sound defensive, like we must have done something wrong. So I think you need to consider, what is it that you want do you need to do any relationship building with that facility partner, with the patient or family? Or like sometimes they've actually talked to attending physicians as well. And so, do you need to do anything in terms of managing, providing some more context because it can be rattling.
Yeah, and the last thing you want is for people to be interviewed and you never hear about it. And what are those people now thinking about the hospice? So they interview a patient and, the patient's family is alarmed, but they never report it. And now what's that patient's family saying about the hospice? That's why you want to kind of try to be proactive in monitoring any kind of activity that might suggest these visits are happening.
It's sort of like when we do our investigation training, you don't have a good compliance program if you never get complaints. Like the fact that you find out about this stuff is a good thing because that means that people feel like they can share this and all of this other stuff. I mean, it's not great that you're getting audited, but a good hospice hopefully finds out about this stuff because there's sort of open, honest transparency among patients, but also staff members know to bring something to compliance if, they hear a patient saying this. So I think hearing about it is actually sort of the best thing possible.
Right. And we have a handout that we've developed to try to discern whether investigations or visits are happening, and then what to do, which is essentially just documenting it. I mean, until you get a record request, there's not a lot of proactive steps you can take, but you can certainly document any interactions that have happened. Maybe take a look at the medical records for those patients, start to see if there are any common threads. But I think it can start, and I think a way to keep this as seemingly as harmless as possible. And what I mean is, you don't want to learn of a visit, and then for the first time you're calling an all hands on deck meeting, and hey, we've got visitors, and we got to go tell make it more routine, like when you're onboarding new staff or when a new patient is being admitted. Just let them know, there's scammers out there, but there's also legitimate government, oversight. And so, we want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of. Just let us know. If you're concerned about anybody visiting you, we think it's a good idea to get credentials before you talk to them, and hopefully begin to develop that trust so that they will come back and report to you. Yeah, somebody stopped by the other day and asked these questions. And then it gives you something to follow up on. If that doesn't kind of turn up any visits, and you do get kind of a call from a person saying, hey, I was just visited, maybe that's a time for a refresher, so that at a next IDG meeting, you kind of remind staff, hey, there's scammers out there, there's government oversight, might be a good time for a check-in. And we've done that, or advised clients to do that, and they have found additional people who have been interviewed. And then it allows us to build the data we have to try to figure out what's going on, what kind of action we need to take, and documenting the details. When did it take place? Who was involved? What was said? That's how we've gotten the information we have. And again, all very helpful as we strategize a response to the audit that's coming around.
And there's a bunch of different handouts that are in the podcast notes that people can pull. And this is one of them, about talking points for staff. And then sometimes these patient interviews end up extending to staff interviews. Like, oftentimes they could come on site and hand deliver this record request, and then they might ask to speak to certain individuals, staff members. And so how do you deal with keeping staff prepared and for on-site auditor visits and what can happen there? Because again, just because they're doing that, it doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It's just, I frankly can't, for all the work we do in this area, I haven't been able to figure out a pattern of when they do that and when they don't do that. It's sort of like business records and record requests. Sometimes they ask for all these business records, but you never really see how that's evaluated or used in the investigation. Same with, I think, these visits. It's always sort of hard to know why they go on site sometimes, not others, why they visit patients sometimes, not others.
Yeah, and in the ones that we've been working on, we've been very proactive. We think that's critical to success, is once you think something is happening with the patient visit, or they're going to come on site and they're going to talk to people, you got to get prepared. And I think we've been fortunate enough that, Meg, I don't recall any of these items that we've worked on have then gone on to anything other than an audit. And an audit is bad enough, but it's not like then there's a False Claims Act, or then there's allegations of actual fraud. And I think an important part of that is you're being prepared. So you're not having, if your staff are going to be interviewed on site, they're not tripping over themselves or speaking out of turn about what their responsibilities are. And we're able to help manage the information. And again, we have handouts that we'll attach to the episode and the episode notes that give you some guidance about, if you're going to be interviewed by an auditor, here's the mind frame, the state of mind you should be in, because it's not a conversation. They're looking for information to use against you.
Yeah. And I guess that's sort of a big pet peeve of mine, is that people, and it starts with language, which is people will say auditors are surveyors, and it's like, they are absolutely not. Like, these are fraud investigators, not people surveying for compliance with the cops, right? They're looking for potential fraud. I mean, we could do, a whole series on survey management and survey prep. And I mean, I'm not saying you should ever, be completely free in your exchanges with any government individual, but these in particular, like, answer the question asked, don't overshare, don't guess at answers. Like, all of these things are really important, and you should be professional and courteous and, develop rapport with people, but that's not by getting real chummy and like,
Yeah.
So it's like how to develop rapport through actions and not oversharing and things like that. And so people really need to understand the difference between surveyors and auditors, and being precise in your language is important, because if you don't understand the difference, then your staff isn't going to get that. And it's like, we treat everyone sort of the same. And this is a much more elevated discussion when you're talking to a fraud investigator over just, a chap surveyor, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of between, the way, I mean, they're not going to read you your rights, right to remain silent. I mean, you don't have to deal with that level of it, but it's good to know, like I said, it's not a conversation. Be direct in the responses. Be honest and accurate. I mean, that's rule number one, of course, in all of this. Don't guess at stuff, because that inevitably leads down a bad path. And, among the handouts we have is 10 questions that we think every hospice employee should know just about the fundamentals. So you don't have a chaplain, when asked who certifies the patients, the chaplain saying, well, I think the nurse does that, which is a situation we encountered and had to do some remedial work on. But just the fundamentals, so that these investigators know you're a sophisticated hospice, you know what you're doing. And then the other handout is kind of actual questions that have been posed about a number of topics during these on-site interviews. Now, it's not the case that they're always going to have in-depth interviews. Sometimes they show up at a hospice just to drop off the record requests, and to drop it off and just say goodbye, and that's great. Other times they're very targeted. They want to talk to this person or that person. And other times it's like, well, we want to talk to the medical director. We want to talk to your clinical manager. And they don't have names. They have titles. But we've been everywhere from just the drop-in. We've been involved in cases that have just been the drop off the letter kind. And we've been involved in cases where it's a multi-day on-site audit with interviews all day long. The latter has not happened recently. So thank goodness for that. But the on-site visits, the more targeted ones, those have continued to happen through the years.
Lots there, Brian. But so these handouts, I think, are really good, and they're fairly timeless. So, print them out once, have them forever. I know people don't like to print anything but me anymore, but I think they're still really great to have in your back pocket. So, literally in the back pocket. I'm not saying right-hand drawer now. I'm saying back pocket. On your person.
Close. Right.
I think you need to have these on your person with your comb in your back pocket.
Yes,
right?
That might be a bit of an inside joke, but yes, back pocket or left-hand drawer maybe. So
yes. So awesome. Well, I'm sure part 100 will be released in 5 years. So
yeah, we'll be back.
So anyway, great.
Yeah, thanks, Meg.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.